Hi, Carl here for ProEV TV, and today we're at the gorgeous Pen Ponds in the middle of Richmond Park, one of our favourite shooting locations, to take a closer look and spend some time with the Canon EOS M50. So the big thing that surprised me the most when I first picked up the M50 was actually how much I enjoyed using it. It is a really lovely and responsive little camera. And I think the word little is very appropriate here. This thing is absolutely tiny. It's only 390 grams. And so when you pair it with a little EOS M lens like this one here, it really is a very small and compact package. The touchscreen is lovely, it flips out all the ways, it's easy to use for selfie mode, but also to flip up like that when shooting videos. And it's a really responsive touchscreen that's very easy to focus off. Canon really know what they're doing with these little screens here. The AEVF isn't bad at all and very useful for bright days like this. One thing that I did find a little bit limiting is only having one dial here on the top. I do miss having several dials to change your aperture, your shutter speed, your ISO, things like that. Having only one dial can be quite limiting if you're used to working with bigger cameras. But I think this is mainly aimed at beginners to video or stills. So for them, actually that will probably simplify things a little bit. So it's not necessarily a bad point, but I have personally found it a little bit limiting. The other thing that really annoys me is this door here at the bottom to access the battery and the SD card is so close to the tripod screw hole. So if you've got any sort of tripod plate on here at all, you're going to have to take it off to open this door in order to change your battery or your SD card. And the battery life isn't great here, so you are going to have to be changing batteries quite a bit, especially with video. So that's a real design flaw. Overall though, really lovely camera to use. So obviously the M50 is primarily a stills camera, not a video camera. That's very evident. And it is a lovely little stills camera too. It's got an APS-C sized sensor in it, which I have a feeling is very, very similar to that in the Canon 80D, which is a very solid stills performer. It's a 24 megapixel sensor, seems to have great dynamic range. It's all very intuitive and the focus seems responsive. I think if you're looking for a small little stills camera, this is a great shout. So the M50 uses Canon's EOS M mount. This is different to their EF mount or their EFS mount. It's designed for mirrorless cameras. That's what the M stands for. It's got a very, very small flange distance and is the secret behind this system being so small. Canon have brought out a range now of EOS M lenses. This is the 18-55, sort of the ordinary kit lens, if you like, that's on the camera right now. This is a very interesting one. This is a 20mm macro lens, and it's got a built-in LED light ring inside. So for when you're getting really close to your subject in a macro shot, you can actually light your subject with the lens, which is very interesting indeed. This is their sort of super zoom, if you like. It's an 18 to 150mm lens. It's not the nicest quality lens, it's probably the weakest out of all of these ones here, but it gets you a fantastic zoom range in a very small little lightweight package. This is a very tiny light lens. And this is a wide angle, so great to see. Always handy to have in the bag. 10 to 22mm wide angle lens. And because this is so tiny, you're actually going to be able to take this with you the majority of the outings that you do with this camera. This is perhaps my favourite of the EOS M lenses though. This is a 22mm f2 lens and it's absolutely tiny. It makes the M50 look almost like a pocket camera or a compact camera. But it's the only f2 prime, in fact, apart from this 28mm macro, it's the only prime in Canon's EOS M lineup, which is quite limiting. I mean, where's the 35? Where's the 50? The 50 would be a beautiful portrait length, and a 35 would be a fantastic walkabout lens. It would be the equivalent of a 50mm on a Super 35 body, on a full frame body. And so I would personally keep a 35 on this camera most of the time, and it would be a beautiful pairing. But at the moment, we're limited to just the 22 if we want fast primes in EOS M. You're not, though, limited to just EOS M. This is Canon's 24-70 f2.8, absolutely lovely piece of glass, but that's not what we're interested in here. That's a very expensive lens, probably 4 or 5 times the cost of the camera. But this is their EOS M to EF adapter, which is almost a bit of a secret weapon in Canon's arsenal with their mirrorless lineup, because they've got such a lovely selection of EF lenses which are really high quality, and a lot of us already own them. If you shoot with, to be honest, most camera categories nowadays, you can put EF lenses on most cameras, whether they're Sony or Panasonic or Canon. But particularly if you shoot with Canon cameras, be them stills or video, you probably own quite a few of these already. And so being able to use with a simple adapter that doesn't lose your autofocus performance, gives you all your normal lens control options on a small little body like this, is a really nice pair indeed. So the M50 was Canon's first mirrorless camera to have 4K video, which is very exciting, but the camera has been out for a while now, and I think it's safe to say that most people were pretty disappointed with the quality of the 4K in here. And I don't blame them. It's got several things wrong with it. The first thing, and by far the biggest thing in my opinion, is that you lose that dual pixel autofocus and you're limited to just contrast-based autofocus. This is a big deal. A lot of what makes this camera great is its dual pixel autofocus that's natively built into the sensor. It's very fast, very reliable, and really brilliant for video work. In 4K, you lose all of that, and it's contrast-based, which hunts all the time. It's just not good. If you're in 4K, turn off that autofocus. The other big problem that people don't like is that it's got a crop. It's another 1.6 times crop over the full width of the sensor. So the sensor, because it's APS-C, is naturally a 1.6 times crop, and then in 4K mode, you get another 1.6 times crop on it again. So this 22mm lens, tiny little f2 prime from Canon, lovely little lens. On this camera normally would be the equivalent of a 35mm lens on a full frame camera, and then in 4K it's going to be the equivalent of a 56mm lens on a full frame camera. It's not the biggest issue. I don't think it's as big of an issue as losing the autofocus is, but it is annoying. Having to change lenses when you go from 1080p to 4K or from stills to video is a pain. It's really nice not to be able to do that. And of course Canon's EOS M lineup isn't wide enough to allow you to do that really, unless you're using one of their zoom lenses. So it is a big shame. The other thing that suffers in 4K is the rolling shutter. You do get more rolling shutter in 4K on this. There's just not the processing power in an affordable entry-level camera like this to do 4K video properly. But I think it is very positive that Canon are willing to put the 4K into small little entry-level cameras like this, because traditionally it's not been something that they've been doing. So I think for the future it's going to be very positive, but there's definitely a lot of drawbacks to using 4K on the M50. So I think for professional work, you should probably stick to 1080p. So these are some of our autofocus tests back in the showroom with the M50. This is 1080p, so it's using Canon's dual pixel autofocus, and it's got the little tiny 22mm f2 lens on it. And as you can see in 1080p with that dual pixel autofocus, it's doing a really solid job of keeping me in focus and looking smooth and natural as it pulls focus. And if we contrast that to this 4K footage, which is using contrast-based autofocus rather than phase detect or Canon's dual pixel, you can see the difference straight away. The 4K is pulsing all over the place, it just can't get me in focus, and even when it does get me in focus, it loses it pretty quickly. This really is not usable video autofocus at all. in my opinion. If you want decent autofocus out of this camera, you're going to get fantastic autofocus in 1080p and really not quite good enough focus in 4K. This is the EF to EOS M adapter. So this is in 4K with that contrast-based autofocus, and you can see it's really struggling, even more so than it was with the native lens. So combining both the adapter and the 4K contrast-based autofocus, it's just not a good idea. However, as we swap across here to 1080p, the adapter actually does a really good job, just as well, I think, as it was with the native lens. So it doesn't look like there's really any difference in video autofocus performance in 1080p with Canon's dual pixel autofocus between using an adapter, specifically their EF to EOS M adapter, and using a native lens, which is really nice to see. This is Canon's C200, so a much higher end camera from Canon, and we threw it in here more out of curiosity than anything. And as you can see, it's doing a rock solid job of pulling focus with me. It loses me for a second because it's not set to face only, it's set to face priority, but it gets me instantly back in when I turn towards the camera. And it does a really nice job of slowly pulling to and from what it wants to have in focus, just like an actual operator was. But the M50 is not that far behind this in terms of performance, and it's actually really close here to the 5D Mark IV as well. Both of these are cameras which could potentially be used as A cameras and using the M50 as a B camera. So this is definitely relevant, and it's fantastic to see that the M50 can keep up with these much larger, much more expensive and much more professional camera bodies from Canon in terms of autofocus. But only, once again, when it's in 1080p. As soon as you change it over to 4K, you lose that dual pixel autofocus and you have to rely on the contrast-based autofocus, which is just nowhere near as good. Overall, the M50 is a really fun little camera to shoot with. So who's it for? I mean, I think its main use is definitely as an entry-level camera. It's at a price point that it's easy to step up to if you're new to the industry, if you're new to working with video cameras, maybe you're a student, something like that. This is a price point that is going to be reachable for many, and you get an awful lot for your money as well. It might not be the most interesting camera out there that you could choose, but it's definitely a sensible, solid, robust choice for you. The other area that I see this being used a lot is B cameras. So if you shoot with maybe a C100 Mark II or a C200 potentially, or 5D Mark IV, this could be a really nice small B camera. You can use the same lenses with the EOS EF adapter, and maybe you're shooting weddings, for example. I had a really interesting chat with a guy who shoots weddings who would quite like to use this as a affordable camera to hide around the ceremony. So hide a couple of them as a couple of unmanned wides, just to mix up the shots during the ceremony. And this is at a price point where you can physically do that. So I think it's got a lot of uses out there. And I think if you're entering the market, this is a brilliant little choice for you. So what do you think of the M50? Let us know in the comment section down below, and I'll see you in the next one.